Despite his towering height, Barron Trump has done a pretty good job of flying under the radar in his first year at New York University. A classmate even caught some heat for saying he's maybe being a little too reclusive.
What if your past came back to you in the most shocking way? On a cold Los Angeles afternoon, Barron Trump's world turned upside down. In the heart of Skid Row, among shattered souls and forgotten lives, he spotted someone he never expected to see. A woman curled up in the cold, wrapped in nothing but a worn-out blanket. His breath caught. It could not be, but it was. Mrs. Henderson, the very teacher who once shaped his future. How did she end up here? What cruel twist of fate brought her from a life of purpose to this unforgiving street? As their eyes met, memories flooded back, lessons of kindness, strength, and resilience. But now, the roles had reversed. Could he just drive away and pretend he never saw her? Or was this moment destiny calling him to change a life, just like she once changed his? Stay with us as we uncover a gripping story of fate, betrayal, and second chances. Because sometimes the most unexpected encounters hold the power to change everything. A cold afternoon in Skid Row. The afternoon in Los Angeles was cold and unwelcoming. A sharp wind howled through the streets of Skid Row, a place where hope seemed to have vanished. Barron Trump sat quietly in the back seat of his luxurious car, lost in his own thoughts. But then, something on the sidewalk made him pause. Among the worn-out tents and weary faces, he noticed a woman curled up, shivering beneath a thin, tattered blanket. A strange, uneasy feeling washed over him. There was something familiar about her, something that pulled at his memory. His chest tightened, and a deep frown settled on his face. He could not explain it, but he knew somehow, in an instant, everything could change. We often take comfort for granted, but what about the future? In a few years, life can take an unexpected turn, bringing even the strongest to their lowest point. Barron understood this in theory, but he had never faced it so starkly, until now. He looked away for a moment, trying to push away the uneasy feeling creeping over him, but he could not. There was something about the frail woman before him that held his gaze. Her hollow eyes and weary face told a story of suffering, as if life had stripped away everything that once made her who she was. The unexpected reunion. Then, like a lightning strike, it hit him. He knew her. The realization felt like a blow to the chest. It was Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who had once guided him, who had believed in him when no one else did. Barron blinked, struggling to make sense of it. How could someone so kind, so dedicated to shaping young minds, end up like this? A wave of sadness and anger crashed over him. This was not right. This was not fair. The car slowed to a stop at a red light, but Barron's thoughts were racing. He could not just drive away, not this time. Barron leaned forward, his chest tightening as he stared at the frail woman before him. His heart pounded, his thoughts tangled in a storm of disbelief and sorrow. She clutched a thin, tattered blanket around her shaking frame, but the relentless wind kept prying it away, exposing her to the bitter cold. Her fingers, once steady and strong, now trembled as she fought to keep warm. His instincts told him to look away, to drive past like everyone else. This was not his battle. He had his own life, his own problems. But another voice, deeper and more insistent, refused to let him ignore what was right in front of him. This was not just any stranger. This was Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson's fall from grace. She had not always been here, lost in the shadows of the city. Once she had a quiet but fulfilling life in Pasadena. Her days were spent in a modest yet warm home, where each morning she would wake early, brew a strong cup of coffee, and carefully prepare her lessons. Teaching was not just her job, it was her passion. She molded young minds, instilled confidence, and nurtured dreams. For years, she was a guiding light for so many, including Barron. But life, unpredictable and cruel, tore everything away from her. It began with an illness, a devastating diagnosis that forced her to step away from the classroom. She thought she would recover, that this was just a temporary pause. Then, the greatest loss of all, her husband's sudden passing. The grief was unbearable. Yet she found solace in the one thing she believed would never fail her: her children. They had promised to take care of her, to stand by her side no matter what. And at first, they did. They called often, checking in, assuring her they would find a way to help. But as time went on, those calls grew less frequent. Their voices, once filled with concern, became distant. Eventually, the calls stopped altogether. Her health continued to decline, leaving her with no choice but to sell her home to cover mounting medical expenses. She had nowhere else to turn but to the children she had raised, the ones she had sacrificed everything for. But when she reached out, desperate and vulnerable, all she found was silence. The hands she once held, the voices that once called her mom, had abandoned her to face the world alone. At first, her children answered her calls with soft excuses. They were busy, their lives were full, and they promised to help, just not yet. But as weeks turned into months, their words became colder. Soon, they stopped calling at all. One day, she realized the truth. She was completely alone. With no money, no family, and no energy to work, sadness filled every part of her. She had spent years helping others, guiding young minds, but now, when she needed help the most, no one was there. Her last hope was a shelter, a place for people with nowhere else to go. She had never imagined herself living in such a place. It hurt her pride, but she told herself it was only for a short time. She just needed to find a way back on her feet. But life did not make things easy. The shelter was nothing like a home. Nights were filled with shouting and crying. Fear was everywhere. People fought over small pieces of food. Sleep was difficult. Every day was a struggle, but she held on. What other choice did she have? Then, the worst thing happened. A fire burned down the shelter, destroying everything she had left. Her ID, photos of her husband, and her few clothes were all gone. She had nothing left. That was how she ended up in Skid Row, a place where people lost not just their homes, but also their hope. The air smelled of garbage. The streets were filled with hunger, cold, and fear. She asked herself every day, how did this happen? How did I go from teaching young minds to being forgotten on these streets? But the hardest part was not the hunger. It was not even the sickness that made her weaker each day. It was the loneliness. Nights in Skid Row felt never-ending. The ground was hard and dirty, covered in broken glass and old trash. The cold was like a knife, cutting through her thin clothes. There were no walls to protect her, no doors to lock. Just darkness all around her and the painful truth. No one was coming to help. The air around her was heavy, filled with the sharp smell of urine, dampness, and hopelessness. Each night felt like a battle for survival. The streets never truly slept, shouting, fighting, and the eerie sound of footsteps creeping closer in the dark kept her on edge. She curled up tightly, clutching an old, dirty bag with the last of her belongings. It was not much, but it was all she had left, and somehow, holding onto it made her feel a little less exposed. But the truth was, nothing could protect her. Danger lurked everywhere, and fear had become a part of her, like a shadow she could not escape. At first, she tried to hold on to some dignity. She picked out the least torn clothes, wiped herself down in public restrooms, and tried to look presentable. But she soon realized it did not matter. People did not see her as a person anymore. The city had given up on her. When she reached out for help, people avoided her, crossing the street or looking the other way. Some pretended not to hear her at all. Being ignored hurt more than the hunger or the cold. It was as if she was disappearing, fading from existence. She often wondered, was she still the same person? Or had she become just another nameless figure on the streets, another soul lost in the crowd of Skid Row? Hunger became her greatest enemy. She had never imagined a day would come when she would dig through trash just to survive. The first time she did it, shame burned inside her, a lump forming in her throat. But hunger was relentless. It stripped away pride, forcing her to do things she once thought impossible. Sometimes she got lucky. A kind stranger would offer a small piece of bread, or a charity group would pass by handing out warm meals. Those moments felt like tiny miracles, but they were rare. There were many nights when she went to sleep with nothing in her stomach, too weak to even lift her head. As the days blurred into months, she felt herself slipping away, not just physically, but emotionally. The hunger took her strength, but the loneliness took something even worse. It stole her hope. It stole her identity. Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who once stood in front of a classroom inspiring young minds, was gone. In her place was someone the world no longer noticed, a woman whose voice had been swallowed by the silence of the streets. She hardly spoke anymore, only whispering when absolutely necessary. Her eyes, once full of knowledge and compassion, now looked empty, as though the world had drained her of everything that once made her whole. She did not know how much longer she could go on like this. Each day felt heavier, but on that cold afternoon, sitting on a dirty sidewalk, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket, she had no idea that a familiar face was about to change her life. A moment of reflection. Barron Trump's car came to a stop at a red light, but his mind was far from the street in front of him. A sudden chill ran through his body, and his heart raced as his eyes locked on the figure sitting on the sidewalk. There, huddled against the cold, was Mrs. Henderson, his old teacher, the woman who had once filled his world with lessons that went beyond what any book could teach. She had taught him about integrity, self-belief, and kindness. But now she was nothing like the strong, inspiring woman he remembered. The sight of her, so broken and lost, left him speechless. Barron's throat tightened, and he blinked several times, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This could not be real, could it? But it was. Without thinking, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, ignoring the curious stares of people passing by. Every step toward her felt heavier, as if his feet were being pulled back by the weight of the situation. He had no idea what to say, or even if she would remember him. But he had to try. His heart was beating faster with each passing moment as he stood in front of her. With a voice that trembled, barely holding together, he said, "Mrs. Henderson?" She paused for a moment, her tired eyes lifting slowly to meet his. Her gaze was worn and distant, but for just a fleeting second, there was a flash of recognition. Barron could see it, a tiny spark of the teacher he once knew. Her voice came out faint, almost like a whisper, filled with disbelief, and something else too, shame. She instinctively tried to hide her hands, stained and rough from the harsh life she had endured, and tried to smooth her messy hair down as if she could somehow erase what had happened to her. But there was no way to hide it. The most painful part was not just that she had been recognized, but that it was by one of her former students, someone who had once seen her as a pillar of strength and wisdom, and now here she was, a shadow of that person, lost in a world that had forgotten her. Her heart broke as she realized that the person who had once looked up to her now saw her like this. She did not want him to see her this way, broken, forgotten, discarded by a world that had once cared. But Barron did not look away. Instead, he truly looked at her, seeing everything she had become, and all that she once was. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The past and the present seemed to collide in a way neither of them could have anticipated. Barron took a deep breath and followed his instinct, because there was no time to hesitate. He could not leave her here like this. "Come with me," he said, his voice both firm and kind. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, unsure. She had been let down so many times before that hope had become something she could no longer trust. People had promised her things before and never followed through, but Barron did not give her time to answer. Without waiting for a response, he extended his hand toward her. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them. It was a silent decision, one that did not require words. Mrs. Henderson hesitated for just a moment. She looked at Barron, then glanced around at the harsh reality of her life, the cold, the dirt, the suffering. Life had taught her not to trust, not to expect kindness from anyone. But here was Barron, a familiar face from her past, offering her something she was not sure she could believe in, a promise of safety, of help, of care. The shame she felt was still there, burning in her chest. She did not want him to see her in this condition, so lost and broken. But the weight of exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was stronger than her pride. With a heavy sigh, she slowly reached up and took his hand, her grip fragile but filled with something deeper than words. Hope, or maybe just the faintest glimmer of it. For the first time in years, someone touched her without disgust. Barron gently helped Mrs. Henderson into the car, and the silence that hung between them was heavy, full of meaning. He could see the weakness in her body, the way her thin skin stretched tight over her bones, the way she trembled even in the warmth of the car. His chest tightened with every movement she made. It was like looking at someone who had fought and lost every battle, someone who never had the chance to heal or recover. As he drove, he could not stand the silence any longer. He wanted to understand, to know what had happened to her. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer than he had expected. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. When she finally did, she told him everything: the illness that had taken her away from the classroom, the sudden death of her husband, the betrayal of her children, and the slow, unforgiving slide into homelessness. Each word was like a blow to Barron's heart. He did not want to believe that things like this could happen to good people, to someone like Mrs. Henderson. But the truth was, pain did not choose who it came for. It did not care if you were good or kind or deserving. When she spoke about the fire that took everything she had left, Barron felt his throat tighten. He could not imagine the kind of loss that made you lose everything. The things that once made you who you were turned to ash. But what shocked him even more was not the story itself. It was the way she told it, without anger, without bitterness. There was only exhaustion in her voice, a deep, overwhelming weariness. When Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, she stared out of the window, her eyes distant. Maybe she expected him to judge her, to blame her for what had happened, to say that she should have done something differently. But Barron did not say anything like that. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel tighter, a storm of emotions building inside him. He could not find the right words to say, but deep inside, he knew that he wouldn't judge her. She had already been judged by the world, and it had failed her. Barron could not accept that this was how her story was going to end. The idea that someone so full of life and purpose had been reduced to this, abandoned by the world, was impossible for him to accept. His face hardened with resolve. There had to be something he could do. He could not walk away from this. He had to help her, not just out of gratitude, but out of a sense of justice for someone who had once given so much. Without a second thought, Barron drove straight to a 5-star hotel. Mrs. Henderson looked around, clearly confused, not sure what was happening. She did not ask questions, but her expression said it all. She did not belong here. This was not her world anymore. Barron noticed the discomfort in her and gave her a reassuring look. "Come on," he said firmly, stepping out of the car. She hesitated, glancing down at her feet, dirty and worn, and at her torn clothes. She felt like she did not fit in, like she did not deserve any of this. But Barron was not going to let her resist. "Please," he added, holding out his hand. This time, Mrs. Henderson took it without hesitation. Inside the hotel, people stole quick glances at them, some even whispering. But Barron ignored them all. He walked straight to the front desk, his focus entirely on Mrs. Henderson. He booked the best room available. No second thoughts. A hot bath, fresh food, and a safe place to sleep. It was the least he could offer her after everything she had endured. When they reached the room, Mrs. Henderson wrapped her arms around herself, still unsure, still afraid to believe that this was real. When she turned to Barron, her voice was barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her words filled with both gratitude and disbelief. A new beginning, Barron's promise. Barron took a deep breath and smiled softly. "Because you never gave up on me," he said gently. "Now it's my turn." Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at him, and for a moment, she wanted to say that she did not need this, that she could manage. But deep down, she knew that would be a lie. She needed this more than anything. She stepped into the bathroom, and for the first time in years, the warm water felt like a gentle comfort against her skin. As her fingers touched her reflection in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She had changed so much, inside and out over the years. But when she emerged from the bathroom, feeling clean and wearing fresh clothes, she felt a small sense of hope stirring again. There was a meal waiting for her, something she had not had in a long time. For the first time in a while, she felt human again, even if just for a moment. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Henderson felt something she had not felt in years: dignity. As she looked at Barron, something inside her told her that this was not a dream, that it was real. But Barron knew that this was just the start. He did not want to help her for just a night. He wanted to help her rebuild her life. With the phone in his hand, he began calling anyone who could make a difference: lawyers, doctors, social workers. He was determined to ensure she had a future ahead of her. But deep down, Barron realized something had changed within him too. He was not just helping her. He was on a journey of change himself. The morning sunlight gently filtered through the window, casting a warm glow across the room. Mrs. Henderson woke up slowly, unsure at first of where she was. The softness of the mattress, the fresh sheets, the quiet peace around her. This was not Skid Row. The reality hit her like a wave, and she felt a tightness in her chest. She did not know how to thank Barron for all he had done, but more than that, she felt like she did not deserve this kindness. Barron entered the room with a soft smile. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. She nodded, still trying to process everything that had changed so quickly. In the weeks that followed, Barron worked tirelessly for her. He arranged medical care, found a safe place for her to stay, and even helped her with financial assistance to get back on her feet. But the most valuable thing he gave her was not money or resources. It was the sense that she mattered. She felt seen again, like someone actually believed in her. For the first time in years, she felt like a person again, not just a forgotten soul lost in the world. Weeks later, Mrs. Henderson had transformed in ways beyond physical appearance. She looked like a new person, not because of the clothes she wore, but because of the light of hope shining in her eyes. Barron had helped her secure a role in a community program where she taught underprivileged children. Holding a piece of chalk in her hand again, it felt like a part of her spirit had been revived. She was back to doing what she loved, making a difference in young lives. When someone asked Barron why he did all of this for her, his answer was simple: "She taught me to be someone." It was my turn to give back. Their meeting was not just by chance. It was a powerful reminder that even small acts of kindness can change the course of someone's life. Sometimes, the best way to show gratitude for the support we have received is by reaching out to those who once helped us rise. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to know how this journey of kindness and second chances made you feel. And if you believe in the power of compassion, then make sure to never miss an inspiring story like this one. Together, we can bring more hope into the world. Thank you for being part of our community.